Racist store owner throws out homeless billionaire. What happens next will stun you. The warm glow of the evening sun spilled onto the clean streets of a quiet, affluent neighborhood. In the middle of the block stood an upscale boutique store, its polished windows displaying rows of neatly arranged luxury items. The sign above the entrance shimmered in gold letters, announcing its exclusivity to anyone passing by. Inside, the faint scent of expensive colognes and fresh flowers filled the air, while soft classical music played in the background. The atmosphere spoke of wealth, sophistication, and a rigid sense of propriety. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Epic Story Moments. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Like, share, and comment to support more incredible stories like this. Behind the counter stood the store owner, Mr. Bradley, a man in his mid-50s. His tailored suit clung perfectly to his stout frame, and his slick-back hair gleamed under the overhead lights. Everything about him screamed authority, arrogance, and control. With an air of judgment, he surveyed his store like a king over his kingdom, ensuring that every customer walking through his doors met his unspoken standards. He took pride in the fact that his boutique catered only to the right kind of people. Mr. Bradley's eyes darted toward the door as the faint chime of the bell announced a new customer. His smug smile faltered when he saw the man who entered. The stranger stood just inside the threshold, hesitant. His clothes were tattered and dusty, the kind worn down not by fashion but by time and hardship. His shoes were scuffed and uneven, as though they had trudged miles. His hair was disheveled, with streaks of silver peeking through the dark strands, and his weathered face carried lines of fatigue and resilience. For a moment, the store fell silent, save for the soft hum of the music. The stranger took a cautious step forward, his hands tucked into his coat pockets as though shielding himself from unseen judgment. Despite his worn appearance, there was something in his posture, straight and purposeful, that hinted at a quiet dignity, a man not broken by circumstance but temporarily caught in its grip. Mr. Bradley's face hardened as he studied the man from head to toe, his judgment already passed before the stranger could utter a word. "Excuse me," the store owner called out sharply, stepping from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" The tone wasn't welcoming. It was a challenge, as though the stranger's mere presence was an intrusion. The man paused, meeting Mr. Bradley's icy gaze with calm eyes. His voice, though soft, carried clarity and intention. "I was hoping to buy a water bottle," he said simply, nodding toward a shelf near the counter. Mr. Bradley's lips curled into a thin, disdainful smile. "A water bottle?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This isn't a convenience store. Perhaps you've taken a wrong turn." The stranger didn't flinch at the insult, his composure unwavering. "I know where I am. I just need something to drink," he replied politely, his tone devoid of anger or defense. Mr. Bradley stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His presence loomed over the stranger, a deliberate attempt to intimidate. "This store caters to a specific clientele," he said slowly, enunciating each word as though speaking to a child. "And I don't think you belong here." A faint murmur arose from the few customers browsing the store. Some glanced toward the scene, their expressions mixed with discomfort and curiosity. Others pretended not to notice, their eyes fixed on the shelves in front of them. No one intervened. The man straightened slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm willing to pay," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. But Mr. Bradley wasn't listening. His gaze fixated on the man's hands, which pulled out a worn wallet. "I think you've wasted enough of my time," the store owner snapped. "We don't need your kind loitering here. Kindly leave before I call security." The words hung heavy in the air, the sharp edge of prejudice unmistakable. The stranger's hand froze mid-motion, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his wallet. His expression remained unreadable, but for a fleeting moment, a shadow of disappointment flickered across his face. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just want to buy a bottle of water and be on my way," Mr. Bradley scoffed, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe the audacity of the man standing before him. "I've already told you," he said firmly, his voice rising. "We don't serve people like you. Now leave." The stranger hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the shelves where the water bottles sat. His shoulders sagged slightly as though weighed down by the moment. He took a step back, slowly turning toward the door. As he moved, his wallet slipped from his hand and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The leather flapped open, revealing a sleek, black credit card that glinted under the store's lights. It wasn't an ordinary card. It was the kind reserved for the ultra-wealthy, the kind that required more than just money, but a status most could only dream of. A sharp intake of breath came from a nearby customer who recognized the card immediately. Whispers rippled through the small crowd as eyes darted between the card and the man who had dropped it. Even Mr. Bradley faltered, his expression briefly shifting from contempt to confusion before settling back into his usual arrogance. The stranger bent down, picking up the wallet and slipping it back into his coat without acknowledging the reactions around him. His calm demeanor remained intact as he walked toward the door, leaving behind a silence that was heavy with judgment and unspoken regret. The bell chimed again as the door closed behind him, and the soft hum of classical music resumed. Inside, the store felt colder somehow, as though the warmth it once held had been stripped away by the moment. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Outside, the man paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath as he glanced at the store behind him. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps resolve, perhaps the quiet understanding of a man who had seen the world for what it truly was. The sound of an approaching car broke the silence, and as the stranger turned to look, a sleek, black luxury vehicle rolled to a stop in front of him. The driver's side door opened, and a sharply dressed assistant stepped out, addressing the man with respect and urgency. "Sir, we've been looking for you," the assistant said, holding the door open. The man nodded slightly, stepping into the car without a word. As the vehicle pulled away, the golden letters on the store sign reflected in its polished windows, a stark reminder of the world the stranger had just left behind. The tension in the store was palpable, a sharp contrast to its serene decor and soothing background music. The stranger, standing at the counter, met Mr. Bradley's disdainful glare with an expression of quiet patience. He had asked for nothing more than a simple bottle of water, yet the store owner acted as if he had requested to upend the very principles upon which the establishment was built. "I already told you," Mr. Bradley snapped, his voice cutting through the soft music like a knife. "This isn't a place for beggars." The stranger, his face calm but weary, stood his ground. His hands rested at his sides, open and unthreatening. "I'm not begging," he said softly. "I intend to pay. I just need a bottle of water." Mr. Bradley scoffed, the sound carrying a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "Pay? With what?" he sneered. "Lent from your pockets? Spare change you scrounged up on the street." The words hung heavy in the air, and a few customers turned their heads slightly, their eyes darting toward the unfolding scene. Most, however, avoided looking altogether, pretending to examine the shelves or their phones. The discomfort was palpable, yet no one stepped forward. "I assure you," the stranger said, his voice steady despite the sharp insults, "I can pay. I don't want to cause any trouble." "You've already caused trouble by walking in here," Mr. Bradley retorted, his tone sharp and unyielding. "We run a respectable establishment, not a charity for people like you." The stranger's brow furrowed slightly at the phrase, "people like you." He took a slow breath, his composure unwavering. "I don't understand why you're treating me this way," he said. "I just want to make a simple purchase." Mr. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back slightly as if to distance himself from the man in front of him. "You don't understand," he echoed mockingly. "Take a look at yourself. This store is for people who value quality, who can actually afford the things we sell. You don't belong here. Another murmur rippled through the small crowd of customers. A middle-aged woman near the perfume display glanced nervously at the stranger, her eyes flickering with a brief flash of sympathy before she turned away. A young couple near the entrance whispered to each other, stealing occasional glances at the scene, but making no move to intervene. The stranger remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady as he studied Mr. Bradley. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet resolve that seemed to unsettle the store owner. "You shouldn't judge people by how they look," he said finally, his tone even and measured. Mr. Bradley's expression hardened, his face turning a shade darker. "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "I've seen enough people like you to know exactly what you're about. You people ruin the environment here. Always looking for a handout, always making trouble." The stranger's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. His silence seemed to fuel Mr. Bradley's anger, the store owner mistaking it for weakness rather than restraint. "Now, I've been more than patient," Mr. Bradley continued, his voice rising slightly. "If you don't leave this instant, I'll call security. Or, better yet, the police. Let's see how fast you scatter when they arrive." The stranger shifted slightly, his hands still at his sides. "I'm not here to cause any harm," he said quietly. "I just need some water. That's all." Mr. Bradley threw up his hands in exasperation, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You just don't get it, do you?" he barked. "We don't serve your kind here. Now get out." The harshness of his words echoed in the otherwise quiet store, making even the most indifferent customers wince. The young couple near the door exchanged uncomfortable glances, and the middle-aged woman near the perfumes fidgeted with the strap of her handbag. The stranger remained still, his expression unreadable. He met Mr. Bradley's glare with calm eyes, his dignity intact despite the verbal assault. "If that's how you feel," he said slowly, "then I'll leave. But you should know that treating people like this only diminishes you, not them." Mr. Bradley's mouth opened as if to retort, but the words seemed caught in his throat. The stranger's words, though softly spoken, carried a weight that silenced even the store owner's arrogance for a moment. But the moment passed quickly, and Mr. Bradley scoffed again, waving the man off dismissively. "Spare me your philosophy," he said with a sneer. "Take your lecture somewhere else and don't come back." The stranger nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He turned slowly, walking toward the door with a quiet grace that seemed out of place in such a hostile environment. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside, the sound marking the end of the encounter, but leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Inside the store, the customers remained still for a moment, the tension still hanging thick in the air. One by one, they returned to their shopping, their movements mechanical as if trying to erase the scene from their minds. Mr. Bradley stood behind the counter, his expression smug and self-satisfied. He adjusted his tie, muttering under his breath about keeping standards and the nerve of some people. But outside, the stranger paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling slowly. Despite everything, there was no bitterness in his expression, only a quiet strength that spoke of a man who had faced far greater challenges than the narrow-mindedness of a single store owner. The distant hum of an approaching car broke the stillness of the moment, and the stranger's gaze shifted toward the street. A sleek, black vehicle rolled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the evening sunlight. The driver's side door opened, and a sharply dressed man stepped out, his demeanor professional and respectful. "Sir," the man said, approaching the stranger with urgency, "we've been looking for you. Is everything all right?" The stranger nodded slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice calm. The two men exchanged a brief glance before the assistant opened the car door, gesturing for the stranger to step inside. The man obliged, his movements unhurried and deliberate. As the car pulled away, the store's golden sign reflected briefly in its windows, a symbol of the world left behind, and the stark contrast of the one the stranger was now returning to. The tension in the store had escalated to a boiling point. Mr. Bradley's sharp voice cut through the air, his tone carrying more venom with each passing second. His irritation was no longer contained. It spilled over in exaggerated gestures and biting words. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he barked, pointing a finger toward the door. "You're not welcome here. If you don't leave right now, I'll call security." The stranger remained calm, though his posture tensed slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Mr. Bradley leaned closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Or maybe I'll call the police. Let's see how fast you scatter when they arrive. People like you don't usually stick around when authority shows up." A murmur rippled through the store's small group of customers. A few brows furrowed in discomfort. Others pretended not to hear, their eyes fixated on shelves or their phones. It was as if the room collectively agreed to ignore the injustice unfolding before them. "I told you before," the man said quietly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted a drink of water. I was willing to pay." Mr. Bradley's face flushed red, his hands slamming down on the counter for emphasis. "And I told you, this isn't a place for beggars. You're wasting my time and ruining the environment for my real customers. Now get out." A few heads turned at that, including a young woman near the perfume section who couldn't hide her frown. She leaned toward the man beside her and whispered, "He didn't do anything wrong." The man shook his head subtly, his voice low. "It's not our place. Let's just leave it alone." Meanwhile, the stranger stood his ground. He seemed unshaken by the store owner's hostility, though a faint crease appeared on his forehead. Without another word, he turned toward the door, his calm retreat further aggravating Mr. Bradley. "That's right. Walk away," Mr. Bradley snapped, throwing his hands in the air. "Next time, try a soup kitchen. This isn't your kind of place." As the stranger approached the door, his foot caught on the corner of the rug near the entrance. He stumbled slightly, and as he regained his balance, his wallet slipped from his coat pocket and fell to the floor. The sound of leather hitting tile was soft, but in the charged silence of the store, it seemed to echo loudly. The wallet flopped open, its contents spilling slightly. Among the mundane items, a folded piece of paper, a few business cards, lay a sleek, black credit card. Its minimalist design and distinctive shine caught the light, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. For a moment, no one moved. Mr. Bradley froze mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he registered the unmistakable Centurion card. It was the kind of card that wasn't just purchased, it was earned. Its presence alone spoke volumes about the man who carried it. One of the customers, a man in his late 40s, gasped softly, his hand instinctively reaching for his partner's arm. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Is that who I think it is?" His partner frowned, following his gaze to the stranger. Recognition dawned slowly, and her eyes widened. "No way. That's him." The man nodded, his voice lowering further. "I'm sure of it. That's Jonathan Rhodes. He's a billionaire, the tech guy who does all that charity work." The woman's jaw dropped slightly, her gaze darting between the wallet on the floor and the unassuming man now stooping to pick it up. "Why isn't he saying anything?" she murmured. The man shook his head. "I don't know, but if he's staying quiet, so am I. You saw how that guy treated him. No way I'm getting involved." As the stranger retrieved his wallet, he glanced briefly at the faces around him. The faintest flicker of recognition passed between him and the middle-aged man, but neither spoke. The stranger carefully placed the wallet back into his pocket, his expression calm but distant. Mr. Bradley, however, seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. His scowl returned, though now it was tinged with uncertainty. "So what?" he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "A fancy credit card doesn't mean anything if it's stolen. You think I haven't seen scammers before." The insult landed heavily, but the stranger didn't flinch. Instead, He looked at Mr. Bradley with the kind of patience one might reserve for a child throwing a tantrum. "You're mistaken," he said simply, his voice as calm as ever. "But I won't argue with you." His restraint seemed to infuriate Mr. Bradley further. "Mistaken? You've got a lot of nerve," he shouted, his voice echoing through the store. "Get out of here before I call the police. You've wasted enough of my time." The stranger nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. He turned to leave, the bell above the door jingling softly as he stepped outside. Inside, the silence was deafening. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, some still processing what they had just witnessed. The middle-aged man who had recognized the stranger shifted uncomfortably, his expression a mixture of regret and fear. "Was that really Jonathan Rhodes?" his partner whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded slowly. "I think so. But what could we have done? You saw how aggressive that guy was." At the counter, Mr. Bradley adjusted his tie, muttering under his breath about keeping standards and the audacity of some people. He glanced toward the customers, his gaze daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Outside, the stranger paused on the sidewalk. He glanced back at the store, his expression unreadable. The faint hum of an approaching car drew his attention, and a sleek, black vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb. A sharply dressed man stepped out, his demeanor professional yet urgent. "Mr. Rhodes," the assistant said, his voice filled with respect. "We've been looking for you. Are you all right?" Jonathan nodded slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. The assistant held the car door open, and Jonathan stepped inside, without another glance at the boutique. As the car pulled away, the store's golden sign gleamed in its reflection, a stark reminder of the encounter and the prejudice that had unfolded within. Outside the store, the air carried a faint chill, the late afternoon sun dipping toward the horizon. Jonathan Rhodes, the man dismissed and insulted moments earlier, stood quietly on the sidewalk, his calm demeanor betraying none of the hostility he had just endured. The sound of a luxury car engine hummed in the distance, growing louder until a sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom came into view. Its glossy exterior gleamed in the fading light, drawing the attention of passers-by. The vehicle pulled up to the curb in front of the store, its presence an immediate indicator of affluence and exclusivity. The car door opened smoothly, and a sharply dressed man stepped out. He was tall and composed, wearing a tailored suit and polished shoes that exuded professionalism. His eyes scanned the area until they landed on Jonathan, and his expression softened with relief. "Mr. Rhodes," the man called, his voice filled with genuine concern and respect. He hurried toward him, adjusting his tie as he approached. "Sir, we've been trying to locate you. Is everything all right?" The murmurs began instantly. A few pedestrians stopped in their tracks, craning their necks to get a better look. Inside the store, customers who had witnessed the earlier encounter turned their heads toward the large windows, their curiosity piqued by the sudden arrival of such an opulent vehicle. Jonathan offered a small, reassuring smile to the assistant. "I'm fine, James," he replied, his tone calm and measured. "I just needed a moment to step away." James glanced toward the store, his gaze lingering on the golden sign above the entrance. He seemed to assess the situation instantly, his brow furrowing slightly as he pieced together what might have occurred. "Sir," he said, his voice lowering, "did something happen in there?" Jonathan shook his head lightly. "Nothing that can't be handled," he said simply. But inside, the dynamic shifted entirely. The customers who had been indifferent now whispered furiously among themselves. "Wait a minute," said the middle-aged man who had recognized Jonathan earlier. He turned to his partner, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did he just say Mr. Rhodes?" "Yes," she murmured back, her eyes wide. "That's definitely him. I told you it looked like him." Near the perfume display, the young couple exchanged astonished glances. "Is that guy seriously a billionaire?" the woman whispered. Her partner nodded slowly, still staring at the scene unfolding outside. Yeah, and not just any billionaire. He's one of the richest people in the world. Owns a dozen tech companies and donates millions every year. The whispers grew louder, blending into a collective hum of disbelief and guilt. Even the customers who had chosen to ignore the earlier confrontation now wore expressions of regret, realizing the gravity of the store owner's behavior. Mr. Bradley, however, remained oblivious. He stood behind the counter, still muttering under his breath about entitled freeloaders and keeping the store's standards. When he noticed the cluster of customers peering out the window, he frowned. "What's everyone gawking at?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Before anyone could answer, the bell above the door jingled as Jonathan re-entered the store, his assistant James following closely behind. The pair's entrance was striking, their composed demeanor commanding immediate attention. Jonathan's ragged clothes contrasted sharply with the tailored precision of James's suit, creating a visual juxtaposition that only heightened the sense of drama. Mr. Bradley's scowl deepened at the sight of Jonathan. "Oh, it's you again," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He didn't seem to notice the change in the room's atmosphere or the assistant standing beside Jonathan, who exuded an air of authority. "I thought I made myself clear," Mr. Bradley continued, his voice rising. "You're not welcome here. I don't care who you've dragged along to back you up." James raised an eyebrow, but Jonathan held up a hand, silently signaling his assistant to remain calm. Stepping forward, Jonathan placed a simple bottle of water on the counter, the same one he had intended to purchase earlier. "I'd like to buy this," Jonathan said evenly, his tone polite but firm. Mr. Bradley snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Oh, you'd like to buy it, would you? And how exactly do you plan to pay this time?" He gestured mockingly at Jonathan's pocket. "With that magic card of yours again? Spare me the theatrics." The room went deathly quiet. Several customers held their breath, their eyes darting between Jonathan and Mr. Bradley. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket, retrieving his wallet with a slow, deliberate motion. He opened it to reveal the unmistakable Centurion card, its black surface glinting under the store's warm lights. Without a word, he placed the card on the counter. Mr. Bradley's smirk faltered. His eyes flicked to the card, then back to Jonathan, then back again. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do, his arrogance wavering under the weight of the revelation. "What's the matter?" Jonathan asked calmly, his gaze steady. "Isn't this acceptable payment?" The customers erupted into hushed whispers, their shock palpable. "That's a Centurion card," one woman whispered, nudging her companion. "Only the wealthiest people in the world have those." "I told you he was a billionaire," the middle-aged man hissed, shaking his head in disbelief. Mr. Bradley's face turned crimson, his bluster draining away as realization dawned. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room's silence was deafening, each second stretching longer than the last. Jonathan leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a low, measured tone. "I came here with no intention of making a scene. I just wanted to buy a bottle of water. But instead of treating me with basic human decency, you chose to judge me by my appearance and assumptions." James stepped forward then, his posture authoritative. "For your information," he said, addressing Mr. Bradley directly, "this man is Jonathan Rhodes, one of the most successful and philanthropic individuals in the world. He could buy this entire block without breaking a sweat." The color drained from Mr. Bradley's face, his arrogance replaced by visible panic. He stammered, searching for words, but none came. Jonathan slid the Centurion card across the counter. "I still want to pay for this," he said quietly, his tone unwavering. Mr. Bradley fumbled to complete the transaction, his hands shaking as he rang up the bottle of water. Jonathan retrieved his card without another word, turning to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. His calm gaze met Mr. Bradley's frightened eyes. "The way you treat people matters," Jonathan said softly. "You should remember that." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned customers and a store owner whose arrogance had crumbled under the weight of his own prejudice. As Jonathan stepped out of the store, his assistant James followed closely behind. The pair walked with a quiet dignity, their presence marked by an aura of calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos left behind. They paused outside, where the golden light of the late afternoon cast long shadows on the pavement. Jonathan turned to his assistant, his gaze thoughtful but resolute. "James," he said, his voice steady, "I've seen that kind of prejudice before. It's not the first time I've been judged by my appearance." James nodded, his expression grim. "It never gets easier, does it?" Jonathan shook his head slightly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "It doesn't matter how much you have or what you've achieved. Some people will still see you as less than what you are based on nothing but assumptions and biases." "I'm sorry you had to go through that, sir," James said, his voice full of respect and empathy. Jonathan glanced toward the store's entrance, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not just about me. It's about every person who's been treated like that. Every person who's been made to feel small because of how they look or where they come from." James stood a little straighter, clearly moved by his boss's words. "You're right, and I think that man just learned a hard lesson about who you really are." Jonathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the building. The store was just one part of a much larger empire he had built over the years. An empire rooted in fairness, opportunity, and respect for others. His focus wasn't just on wealth. It was on creating change and showing that people from all walks of life deserve the same dignity. Back inside the store, Mr. Bradley was still fumbling with the register, his face flushed with embarrassment. He muttered under his breath, completely unaware of the consequences of his actions. The customers who had witnessed the encounter were still whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mix of disbelief and guilt. A few moments later, the bell above the door jingled again, this time more sharply than before. James stepped inside, his posture commanding attention. The moment he entered, the room fell silent. He strode up to the counter, his eyes meeting Mr. Bradley's with a level of authority that the store owner had not seen before. "I'm afraid I have some news for you," James said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. Mr. Bradley, still recovering from his earlier fluster, looked up, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "What do you want now?" he snapped, though the edge in his voice wavered under the growing tension. James leaned slightly forward, his tone cool and unyielding. "You see, Mr. Bradley, you've made a grave mistake today. The man you so callously dismissed is Jonathan Rhodes. You know, the billionaire you thought was just some homeless guy." A few gasps echoed around the store as the revelation hit once again. Mr. Bradley's face turned pale as he finally pieced everything together. The Centurion card, the calm demeanor, the powerful aura of the assistant standing before him. His heart began to race. James continued, his voice even but heavy with finality. "And that building you're renting from? Mr. Rhodes owns it." The words hung in the air, thick with the gravity of what was coming. The store owner's eyes widened in horror, his mind scrambling to process the consequences. You can't be serious," Mr. Bradley stammered, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter. I didn't know. I didn't mean any harm." James raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Oh, I'm quite serious. And Mr. Rhodes has already made it clear that he will be terminating your lease." The color drained from Mr. Bradley's face as he looked around the store, his panic rising. His customers, those few who were still in the store, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and discomfort. There was no denying the impact of the words. But we've been here for years," Mr. Bradley blurted out, his voice high-pitched. "I'll do anything. I can fix this. I'll apologize to him. Please, I'll make it right. You don't have to do this." James's expression remained impassive. "Mr. Bradley, you've already shown who you are. You made a decision based on nothing but prejudice, and now it's time to face the consequences. You won't be getting any second chances here." Mr. Bradley's hands shook as he fumbled with the papers on the counter, his mind racing to come up with some excuse, some way out of the inevitable. I didn't mean it like that. I was having a bad day. I've got a lot of stress on my plate. Please, just let me talk to him. James stepped back, his gaze unyielding. There's nothing left to talk about. Your actions have already spoken louder than anything you could say now. The store owner swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He glanced nervously at the customers watching, all of them witnessing his fall from arrogance to panic. No one seemed inclined to come to his defense, and the weight of his previous insults hung heavy in the air. I'll have to close the store, Mr. Bradley muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. What am I going to do? I can't afford to lose the space. James paused, allowing the words to sink in. That's exactly what's happening, and no amount of apologies will change that. You'll be vacating the premises within 30 days. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Mr. Bradley's shoulders slumped, and he leaned back against the counter, his confidence shattered. He had never expected such a fate, especially for something so small, an insult born of prejudice, a moment of arrogance. Now, that moment had cost him everything. As James turned to leave, he glanced once more at the store sign, a reminder of how quickly the tables had turned. The billionaire had walked in, and the man who had once been so full of himself had crumbled under the weight of his own ignorance. Outside, Jonathan Rhodes was already in the car, heading back to his next meeting, unfazed by the petty drama that had unfolded in the store. He had done what needed to be done, not out of spite, but out of principle. The lesson was clear, but whether Mr. Bradley would learn it remained to be seen. For now, karma had done its work, and it had served him cold. As Jonathan Rhodes and his assistant, James, stepped out of the store, the late afternoon light bathed the street in a soft, golden glow. The luxury car that had arrived earlier was parked by the curb, its engine humming quietly, waiting to take them to the next destination. The events inside had left a ripple of tension in the air, but Jonathan was calm, his demeanor unshaken. As he moved toward the car, he paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the store's windows. Inside, a few customers still stood in hushed conversation, their eyes on him. Jonathan took a deep breath and turned back toward the store. He wasn't in any rush, and there was something important he felt needed to be said. James, ever the professional, stayed a few paces behind, sensing that his boss had something more to address. With purpose in his stride, Jonathan re-entered the store. This time, the mood inside had shifted. The earlier air of tension had morphed into something else entirely, embarrassment. Mr. Bradley was nowhere to be seen, likely locked in his office or retreating to the back to nurse his wounded pride. The customers who had witnessed his outburst were still there, some lingering, others anxiously heading toward the exit. Jonathan stood at the front of the store, his presence commanding attention. For a moment, there was an awkward silence before he spoke. I don't want anyone to remember me as the homeless billionaire or the man who got treated unfairly. That's not what this is about, he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight of emotion. This is about something far more important. The room quieted. Jonathan's eyes swept over the crowd, seeing the shame in their expressions. He knew they felt guilty, maybe for not speaking up, maybe for failing to recognize the prejudice in the store owner's actions. But now, this was the moment to teach them something greater than just about wealth or appearances. What happened here today wasn't about me, he continued. It wasn't about how much money I have or what car I drive. It was about how one person, who should have treated me like a human being, chose to see me based only on the way I looked. And that's the danger of prejudice. It blinds us. It makes us judge people by things that have nothing to do with who they truly are. The room was still, every word resonating deeply. Jonathan's words weren't laced with anger or bitterness. Instead, they carried a quiet strength. The customers stood frozen, taking in every word, realizing the deeper meaning behind the encounter they had witnessed. Jonathan paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before he spoke again. Kindness, empathy, and respect for others. That's the currency we should be spending every day, not the wealth we accumulate, not the cars we drive or the clothes we wear. What matters is how we make others feel. And we're all capable of that, whether we're in a 5-star restaurant or a corner store. We all have a choice. A few heads nodded, the truth of his words beginning to settle in. The message was clear. Empathy was the key to a better world. Jonathan's eyes softened as he glanced at the employees behind the counter, and then he saw her. The young woman who had been standing quietly off to the side, watching the whole ordeal unfold. Unlike the others, she hadn't joined in the whispers or avoided eye contact with him. She had remained silently compassionate, clearly uncomfortable with what had happened, but choosing to remain neutral. He made his way over to the counter, walking up to the young woman. She looked up, startled to see him standing in front of her. "Thank you," Jonathan said simply, "for seeing me as a person, not a stereotype. Your kindness didn't go unnoticed." Her cheeks flushed, and she stammered slightly. I didn't do anything, sir. I just didn't feel right about what was happening." Jonathan smiled warmly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a generous tip. "You did more than enough. This is for you." Her eyes widened, the tip far exceeding what she might have earned in a whole week. She took the money in her hands, speechless. Jonathan's kindness was not just in the words he spoke. It was in his actions, and now she felt it deeply. As he turned to leave, he addressed the rest of the crowd one final time. "We all have the power to choose our actions," he said, his voice carrying a quiet but powerful command. What happened here today was a reminder of how easy it is to make the wrong choice. But it's also a reminder that we can always choose to do better. We can choose kindness over judgment, empathy over indifference. So, when you leave here today, remember this moment and carry it with you, because it's never too late to make a better choice. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The customers stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking deep into their consciousness. Outside, James opened the door of the Rolls-Royce, and Jonathan slid into the back seat. The car's engine roared to life, and the luxury vehicle glided smoothly down the street, leaving the store and its lessons behind. As they drove off into the distance, the streets of the affluent neighborhood seemed somehow quieter, more reflective. People had witnessed a powerful moment, not just of justice, but of profound understanding. The billionaire had not only revealed his wealth, but had left behind a lasting message that would stay with them long after he was gone. And in that moment, Jonathan Rhodes felt something more rewarding than any amount of money. He had planted a seed of change, a seed that, with time, could bloom into a kinder, more empathetic world. In the story, several profound themes are explored, offering a deeper reflection on society and human behavior. These themes not only drive the narrative, but also impart valuable lessons that challenge common prejudices and assumptions. #1. Empathy and dignity asterisk. At the heart of the story lies the theme of empathy and dignity. The initial conflict is sparked by the store owner's inability to see beyond the homeless appearance of Jonathan Rhodes. This judgmental stance illustrates how quickly society can dehumanize people based on their outward appearance. The store owner's refusal to serve Jonathan is a direct result of his inability to empathize with someone who doesn't fit his preconceived notions. Jonathan's calm composure, despite the insults and mistreatment, highlights the importance of maintaining one's dignity in the face of adversity. By not reacting in anger or bitterness, Jonathan underscores the power of empathy, both from the person who is being judged and from the audience witnessing the injustice. His response becomes a lesson for everyone around him, showing that empathy can bridge divides, challenge stereotypes, and restore a sense of human connection. The store owner, in contrast, is blinded by his prejudice and fails to see Jonathan as a person, leading to his ultimate downfall. This shift in perspective, where Jonathan's dignity shines through despite external judgment, teaches that empathy, not judgment, is the key to understanding and respect. #, Hashtag 2. Social justice asterisk. Social justice is another central theme that is woven throughout the story. The power dynamics between Jonathan and the store owner exemplify how systems of inequality and prejudice are often upheld by ignorance and entitlement. At the beginning, the store owner uses his perceived authority over Jonathan, dismissing him as just a beggar and pushing him out of the store. This act of discrimination represents a broader societal issue: the unequal treatment of people based on their social or economic status. However, the story quickly demonstrates how power can shift and prejudice can backfire. Jonathan, who initially appears to be the underdog due to his ragged clothes, is revealed to be a powerful figure, a billionaire who owns the very building the store occupies. This sudden shift challenges the preconceived power dynamics and exposes the store owner's misjudgment. The store owner's arrogance and prejudice lead him to make a costly error. He loses his business and is left to face the consequences of his discriminatory actions. This moment serves as a stark reminder that prejudices are not only harmful to individuals, but can have societal and economic repercussions. Social justice, in this case, is not about revenge. It is about the realization that those who misuse their power will eventually have to reckon with their actions. Hashtag 3. Class versus humanity asterisk. The tension between class and humanity is a pivotal theme in the story. The store owner's dismissal of Jonathan stems from his assumption that wealth is tied solely to appearance, and that a person's worth is determined by their financial status. The store owner sees only the ragged clothes and worn-out shoes and fails to recognize the potential humanity and wealth that lies beneath. This reflects a narrow, superficial view of society, where external appearance often determines how a person is treated. In contrast, Jonathan Rhodes embodies the idea that true wealth isn't just about money or possessions. It is about character, humility, and the ability to treat others with respect. Throughout the story, Jonathan remains calm and dignified, never using his wealth as a weapon, but instead demonstrating that true strength lies in how one treats others. The revelation that Jonathan owns the store building further underscores this point. His wealth is not flaunted. It's quietly reflected in his actions and values. The story challenges the audience to reconsider the true definition of wealth, illustrating that material riches are temporary, but the richness of character lasts. Ultimately, this clash between class and humanity reveals that true worth comes from the ability to recognize and respect the humanity in others, regardless of their social or economic status. The final act of kindness, where Jonathan rewards the sympathetic employee with a generous tip, reinforces this idea. Humility and empathy are far more valuable than any material possession. These themes come together to create a story that is not just about wealth or power, but about how individuals can rise above societal expectations and make a meaningful impact. The story teaches that empathy, justice, and humanity are the true measures of value in our interactions with others.